We're here because for Healed Palestine, which is it's a good name because that's what we want in the end. Some of the speakers, I'm gonna give you the bad news, but some of the speakers might not be able to attend from New York, so I'm sorry about that. So you're stuck with me and Randa and Norman. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Randa Abdel-Fattah.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered today and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I want to thank Heal, I want to thank Adi Road, Rosanna, Farid for having me today. It means a lot to be in a safe space as Palestinians, to be able to speak among family and friends. And the extension of the word family has changed for us all now. We are all part of a family and we're all bleeding and crying and fighting and resisting together. For racialized immigrants and refugees who form what Nadine Neighbor calls the diaspora of empire, Asl is everything, our roots, our origins. Who is your father? Who is your grandfather? What village originally? I'm the daughter of a Palestinian man who is older than the illegitimate state of Israel. The daughter of an Egyptian mother whose family's life trajectory in Egypt was impacted by colonialism, forcing them to migrate to this colony. So we, the diaspora of empire, are the product of these global power relations that complicate our positions, our identifications, beyond just a mere, indigenous settler binary. We live on indigenous land as beneficiaries of settlement, whilst we traverse subject positions as victims of imperialism, the global military-industrial complex, and racial capitalism. And so the work that we do is to borrow from African-American scholar Robin Kelley, rooted in an analytic of world-making. That is, a shared vision of mutual liberation based on the indivisibility of justice and imagining revolution together. And so I return always to Asl, origin, not just mine, but the unceded lands of the Darug people on whose land I live, write, fight, protest, and raise my children on and from. It is becoming increasingly surreal, obscene even, going through the motions of daily life, arguing, pleading, analysing, discussing our right to life as Israel advances through our lands like a knife through butter. I feel like we're all living on an intravenous drip of massacre and slaughter. Now, when your people and lands are burning and instead of offering water, the world offers kerosene, it is tempting to descend into a state of debilitating anguish and incandescent rage. But until the last person, we must, to borrow from Ghassan Kanafani, continue to write and speak for Palestine with our blood. Everything that needs to be said has been said for over 100 years. And yet when I go through our movement's archives, here in Australia, for example, I find argument and analysis going back decades, and they strike a chord. They mobilise and contribute to building our movement with a new generation that provokes and inspires new ways of thinking and organising. And so we must never stop bearing witness, speaking out and back, even as we are standing at the edge of an apocalypse. Israel is seeking to destroy us, to wipe Palestinians and Lebanese and Arabs off the map. And the story of this genocide is in the maps. At the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, the World Zionist Organization presented a map in which the proposed Jewish state included not just all of Palestine, but the East Bank of Jordan, southern Lebanon, the Golan Heights, and parts of the Sinai. We are about to approach the anniversary of 7th of October, but there was a more important anniversary, and that was on 22nd of September, 2023. That was the day Netanyahu smugly addressed the United Nations and held a map of Israel that covered the entire land from the river to the sea. And since 7 October, we have seen live streamed to our screens scenes of violence methodically inflicted on an entire population as the world watches on, in service of a political project that has unfinished demographic business, that requires the extermination of the brutes, the elimination of the native, in order to achieve the goal of a Jewish majority and purported sovereignty over the entire stolen land from the river to the sea. Each day has been a horrifying chronicle of industrialized genocide, domicide, scholasticide, femicide, medicide, ecocide. Israel, which many, including Edward Said, characterized as an armed garrison state, has, with its patron superpower, the US, acted with complete impunity, drunken, unbridled power. But what is heinous today is banal tomorrow, as Israel's frenzy of malevolence and savagery intensifies. Displacement was shocking, then bombing them in their tents was shocking, then shooting at people as they fled from their homes was shocking, then bombing the people trying to rescue trapped, burning bodies was shocking, until bombing Palestinians is so normalized that it is no longer shocking. Priming the world to accept the slaughter and bombing campaign we are now seeing Israel unleash on Lebanon. Assassinations, Palestinian negotiators, leaders, humanitarian workers, extrajudicial killings, terrorist booby traps on Lebanese civilians, setting dogs on disabled people, systematic rape of men, women and children in their dungeons, and then protests defending the right to rape. Barbecue parties outside Gaza filming children stomping on food aid, deliberately shooting children in the head, leaving babies in neonatal care to decompose, bombing an IVF clinic, throwing Palestinians off rooftops, TikTok videos, on and on it goes. Israel's depravity is cumulative, relentless, and the worst chapter of a continuing and ongoing story of the Zionist project's political goal of removing the Palestinian presence from historical Palestine and slaughtering all who resist and stand in its way. What we are bearing witness to in Palestine is not the myth of terra nullius, or a land without a people for a people without a land, but the attempt to realize the goal of the Zionist project, articulated in that map in 1919 and in Netanyahu's vision as he openly presented it to the world a year ago. The goal of manifesting terra nullius, to render the land empty, empty of the native, the subhuman, to deliver a land without the Palestinian people for a people who stole their land. Almost 1 year into this horror, the Western world, including the state of Australia, not only refuses to stop this extermination campaign, but is actively and openly sponsoring it. Israel has just conducted in Lebanon what Palestinian surgeon Ghassan Abu Sitta called the largest act of mutilation that we have seen. The bombs in the pages and devices were strong enough not to kill, but to maim even more than what we saw in Sierra Leone between warring parties, where they were chopping hands as a tactic. It was a deliberate campaign designed to mutilate, reminiscent of the Great March of Return, where Israel shot over 8,000 people, deliberately targeting them in their lower limbs to inflict paralysis, amputation, and mutilation. And after that, the indiscriminate bombing started. And what did our Foreign Minister Penny Wong say? What did she tweet? She advised Lebanese people from Australia to leave Lebanon. Not sanctions or weapons, parts freezes, or demands on the ambassador, just a suggestion to get out of the way while Israel gets on with it, as one person on X put it. We know why Australia supports the Zionist colony. It's not simply a matter of shared ideology and values or mutually beneficial trade deals, but Australia remains deeply committed to its own political project here of slow, invisibilised genocide across Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So the glue between Australia and Israel, between Israel and the UK, between Israel and the US is white supremacy. And I want to finish my talk by talking about white supremacy and whose voices count as testimony. And I'll do this from the perspective of as an academic working in the university sector. This year, students at Melbourne University's encampment named the Arts West building Mahmoud's Hall in honour of Mahmoud Al-Nouk, a student from Gaza who was awarded a scholarship to Melbourne University to do a master's degree in international relations. Israel killed him on 22nd of October. No university in Australia, including Melbourne University, has condemned his murder. I really encourage you to look up his Twitter account. Not because I wish to exceptionalize him or claim his life mattered more than any of the other students Israel has murdered. Entire books have been written about the metrics of genocide, about the failure of methodologies and an enumeration to account for the sheer horror. When we recite numbers, there is, in that very process, something so grotesque and dehumanizing about counting in a time of genocide. Sometimes we hear over 40,000, approximately 1,300 in Lebanon, some X number of people, just under And one wonders who becomes counted and who becomes lost in the dehumanization of approximation. Who becomes a carry the one, a remainder in the maths of genocide, which drops bombs so that a whole body cannot be counted, so that an arm with a name written on it is pulled into one metric and an unidentified torso into another. The Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part. So I find myself spending a lot of emotional and mental energy thinking about the individual parts that make up the monstrous, incomplete sum. So Mahmoud Al-Nouk, look up his Twitter account, and there you will find distilled into his timeline an anatomy of genocide before and after 7 October. In May 2023, he was tweeting about Israel's large-scale attack on Gaza, sharing articles and tweets about Gaza's depleted hospitals, about cancer patients, including his mother, blocked from travelling for urgent treatment. His timeline is a living archive of Israel's pre-7 October slow genocide of Gaza, the impact on the population, opportunities for women to work, freedom of movement, children killed in airstrikes, journalists banned. From 7 October, he was documenting atrocity after atrocity using the hashtag Gaza under attack, sharing exposés about the beheaded baby's lie, asking, is it anti-Semitic to fight for your life? His timeline was real-time testimony. It was a frenzy of desperation to find the Western world's red line. And when the death toll was 400 children, he was beside himself, and I wonder, what would he say now? But from 7 October, he was using the hashtag Gaza under attack. And then on 13 October, he tweeted hashtag genocide. And a second tweet that day, Gaza genocide, and the world is cheering it on. End the madness. What was he telling us from his grave? The International Court of Justice, all these legal institutions and structures serve a purpose, but they are the floor, not the ceiling of justice. Because he didn't need an international legal body to name the facts on his ground. Less than a week of atrocity and war crime after war crime, he concluded hashtag genocide. And contained in that hashtag is every theory on race and white supremacy and the inherent violence of the international legal system. Mahmoud's hashtag was contemporaneous, undoctored witness testimony. It was a brown body telling a white world, I will name my reality, I will demand my measure of justice, and I will tell you what is happening. A week later, he was killed. There is no witness protection program for Palestinians when Israel is granted impunity to commit genocide. For the past year, we have seen a stream of witness testimony from social media. And that witness testimony, more than ICJ rulings and talking heads and even academics, has galvanized and rightly radicalized people, especially students. Palestine is and always has been a focal of knowledge production. It has things to teach us all. It is because of the moral failure of universities across the Western world to publicly bear witness to and engage with the most profoundly significant, shattering moment of our time that students and youth of the world are doing what legal institutions, human rights bodies and governments have failed to do. Students didn't wait for Melbourne University to honour Mahmoud. Mahmoud's hall was a clarion call that a hashtag from a young student in Gaza, who at the time had less than 400 followers, could change the world. Students at Macquarie University, Melbourne University, Sydney University, students at Hinds Hall in the US, and universities across the US and the UK and Australia, they did not wait for universities and faculties to mark this moment. Revolutions are contagious, and this generation of students and youth are showing us they will reject every colonial vaccine and anesthetic designed to numb, distract us, render us immune to injustice. I never knew Mahmoud. He stopped tweeting on 16 October. Israel murdered him and 20 of his family members in an airstrike on 22nd of October. One of the last tweets he composed was a plea to end the madness. What is this madness he was speaking about? It's the madness of a world where a US-funded, Western-backed military superpower can try to annihilate a population every day for the last year, and people who support this annihilation, who support this regime, walk amongst us in our workplaces, universities and streets and say they are unsafe. They say they are the victims. It is a madness of a world that criminalizes chance, not bombs, that is triggered by scarves, not shrouds. He asked us to end the madness. He was one person and one soul, one young man who had dreams and ambitions. When I heard of his death, I searched for him on X and I saw something that made me weep for hours. Follow back. He would have been in Gaza, excited about coming to Australia on a scholarship. And I don't know how he came across me or why he followed me, but that follow back bound me and Mahmoud and every student in Gaza in a moral contract. The death toll keeps tolling in grotesque numbers, but it told at one person as he tweeted #genocide. And one person is enough for us to persist in fighting to the end of this madness. And fight we should continue to do until the only hashtag left is Palestine is free.
Thanks so much for your powerful words, Randa. Thank you so much, Norman, for joining us from New York. Please make him feel welcome.
As I said, thank you for having me, and I listened closely to the words of Randa. I had some disagreements here and there, which is perfectly normal, since we're not exact replicas of each other. Were that the case, the world would be a very boring place, since a large part of life is learning from others. But the overall picture, I have to say, is her overall depiction was as correct as it was grim. I would simply add that it has seldom been grimmer than it is right now. Not in my recollection, at any rate. And since I'm already 70 years old, it is a long recollection. And I don't remember times quite as grim as this, most in part because it's been nearly a year and it's just business as usual each day, which is kind of shocking. I'm just going to make some brief remarks because I think the purpose of this evening is to enable people to pose questions that are concerning to them and then to provide, at any rate, provisional answers. I'll just, as I say, make some some preliminary remarks. Number one, as everybody in the room knows, a standard question became after October 7th, and Israel embarked on its genocide in Gaza. The question was, what was Israel supposed to do? And the other form of that question was, do you condemn Hamas? And the second question was a kind of litmus test question. If you answered no, you were out of the conversation. If you answered yes, you were part of the conversation, and you can express this or that disagreement with mainstream discourse, but it's within the parameters of you condemned Hamas. And I would like to briefly address those two questions, namely, what was Israel supposed to do, and do you condemn Hamas? Since October 7th, I work with a small group of young people, very sharp and very conscientious. And one of the interesting things that they uncovered, not me, was already from the early 1950s, when Gaza was under Egyptian control. Already back then, there was a prominent senior UN official working in Gaza. He went by the name of E.L.M. Burns. And if you read his account of his experience in Gaza, he described Gaza as a concentration camp. You come to 1967, right after the June 1967 war. The father of Al Gore, who ran for president in the United States in 2000, the father of Al Gore, he was a senator, and he visited Gaza, and he gave some testimony in June, shortly after the war, and lo and behold, he describes Gaza as a concentration camp. You then come to 2004, the head of Israel's National Security Council. His name is Giora Eiland. He's still around. He's an advisor to Defense Minister Gallant. He's the one who has been heaping praise on spreading epidemics in Gaza because it will facilitate Israel's aims. In any event, in March 2004, he described Gaza as a huge concentration camp. A couple of years before, a senior sociologist at the Hebrew University, his name is Baruch Kimmerling, he's passed, and he wrote a little book called Politicide, and he described Gaza as, well, you can probably guess it by now, he described it as the largest concentration camp ever to exist. Now, everything I've just said was before Hamas came to power in January 2006. And what's more important, before Israel had turned the screws on the economic blockade of Gaza, which began in 2006. By 2007 and 2008, Israel was counting the number of calories that would be admitted into Gaza on a per capita, which means per person basis, so as to keep Gaza on what was called humanitarian minimum diet, which can be also construed as keeping Gaza on a starvation plus diet. And the reasons were very, if not publicly, still privately acknowledged. The purpose was, to quote the statements of the Israelis, to keep Gaza on the precipice so as to incite a revolt by the Gazan people against Hamas and overturn the government. So, with that in mind, we begin to approach the question of, do you condemn Hamas? Now, you can make the argument that as horrendous as the conditions were in Gaza, why didn't Hamas choose other options? Why didn't it try diplomacy? Why didn't it try nonviolent resistance? Why did it have to resort to the horrific episodes on October 7th? Well, the answer to that is pretty simple. It did try everything. anyone who followed those years will remember that once Hamas came into power, it was signaling on many different diplomatic fronts that it was prepared for a diplomatic settlement based on what's called the international consensus, namely 2 states on the June 1967 border, and so forth. All of those attempts by Hamas at a diplomatic settlement were peremptorily refused by Israel and the United States. Facing an impasse on the diplomatic front, Hamas attempted in March 2008 and, March 2018, and Randa already alluded to it. They attempted a nonviolent civil resistance, what was called the Great March of Return. So how did Israel react to that? Well, we know because there was a 250-page single-spaced report, very exhaustive, issued by an international commission affiliated with the UN. And they said that Israel targeted, this was overwhelmingly nonviolent. It targeted children, it targeted medics, it targeted journalists, and it targeted people with physical disabilities, like it targeted a double amputee. The people who they targeted were 100 to 300 meters from the separation barrier between Gaza and Israel. Well, instead of asking the question, what was Israel supposed to do? It seems to me there is a preliminary question. What was Hamas or the people of Gaza supposed to do? By October 6th, the night before October 7th, it was quite clear what fate had been prescribed. What fate had been prescribed for the people of Gaza? Their fate was to be born into, to languish in, and then to die in a concentration camp. That was their fate. By October 2006, the only talk in the town was the Abraham Accords and expanding them to include Saudi Arabia. And at that point, the Middle East question would be solved above the heads of the people of Gaza, who were fated to be born, to languish in, and to die in a concentration camp. So I think that in order to answer the second question, one has to first answer the second question, meaning what was Israel supposed to do? I think one is duty-bound, obliged to answer the first question first. What were the people of Gaza supposed to do? Now, that brings us to the events of October 7th and thereafter. In my opinion, Israel won 99% of the propaganda war beginning on October 8th and until today. If you look at the print media, I don't follow the web scene very much, but I'm sure it's not different. There's one framework for analyzing all the events in Gaza. There's one framework. it's sort of like that litmus test. You have to condemn Hamas or you couldn't be part of the conversation. The second thing you have to do is you have to refer to the Israel-Hamas war. Every article, every public presentation has to begin with that framework. This is a Israel-Hamas war. In fact, and as I said, once you start there, Israel's won 99% of the propaganda war because there isn't a war in Gaza. There's no war in Gaza. There is a genocide in Gaza. And a war is very different than a genocide. A war is fought primarily between armies and combatants and/or combatants. In a war, your aim is to militarily prevail over your antagonist or adversary. That's the objective of a war, to win the war by militarily prevailing over your adversary. A genocide is very different. A genocide is not fought between two armies. A genocide is fought between one army and the civilian population. That's the object of the genocide. In a genocide, the aim is not to militarily prevail over your antagonist. The aim is to exterminate the civilian population. That's something very different. The classic study of the Nazi Holocaust was written by somebody named Raoul Hilberg. And his famous became a 3-volume study of the Nazi Holocaust. He was a brilliant sociologist, but let's just call him a brilliant scholar. And because he studied the record, he had a remarkable grasp of the documentary record. He called his monumental study the destruction of the European Jews. He didn't call it the war against the European Jews. He called it the destruction of the European Jews because it wasn't a war. It was a genocide. And as I said, the principal objective of a genocide is not to defeat militarily your adversary. Your objective is the physical annihilation of your adversary. If you look at the record since October 7th, it's completely preposterous to describe what's happened as a war. Were it the fact that it were a war, how would you account for the fact that one of the main targets is hospitals? Does that sound like the aim being to militarily prevail over your adversary? Why would a second main target be universities? Does that sound like the object being to militarily prevail over your adversaries? More journalists have died now in Gaza than in any comparable conflict since World War II. It's 116. There was actually a very excellent segment on the targeting of journalists this past week on NBC in the United States, NBC News. It's well worth watching because, believe it or not, it's accurate. If it were a war, why would an unprecedented number of UN workers, 200 at last count, why would 200 UN workers have been killed? If it were a war, and you can go on and on, if it were a war, why are you dropping 2,000-pound bombs on designated refugee centers? Does that sound like you're trying to militarily prevail over your adversary? The point being that you cannot make any sense of what's happened the last year using the idiom or the vocabulary of war. Whereas if you use the idiom and vocabulary of genocide, then everything in the past year falls neatly into place. So it's very striking. For example, the UN has put out several reports under the chairmanship of Navi Pillay, who was the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, on Gaza. And this commission, headed by her, tries to analyze the events in Gaza on the basis of the laws of war. And they say, Israel violated this law of war. Israel violated that law of war. And Israel should do this instead of that. Israel should do that instead of this, in order for Israel to be in compliance with the laws of war. But that report misses the point. It's not like Israel is in error by violating the laws of war, because Israel is not engaged in a war. Israel is not violating the laws of war. What Israel is doing is executing the logic of genocide, something very different. The problem with Israel is not that it's not in compliance with the laws of war. The problem with Israel is it's in compliance with the logic of genocide. That's the problem. So, in a genuinely heroic effort, the South African legal team at the International Court of Justice attempted to change the framework for understanding what's happening. And so they charged Israel with genocide, not with violating the laws of war. Unfortunately, even as they did achieve remarkable success at the International Court of Justice, within the mainstream, that framework has not been used at all. As I said, you're under an obligation, if you want to be part of the conversation, to refer to the Israel-Gaza war. I'll just say one last thing, and then I'll stop, which is the present moment. The present moment is very grim. And speaking strictly for myself, I wasn't able to get through almost any work today because of the concern about the fate of Syed Nasrallah, whatever you think of his politics, and reasonable people can disagree or agree to disagree, there's no question in my mind that he has come to personify, to embody, to incarnate a refusal to bend the knee to Israel. And it was striking to me when I was listening to some coverage of the funerals for the three senior Hezbollah officials, assuming for the moment we don't know Mr. Nasrallah's fate. For the three senior Hezbollah officials, I was very taken by the chant at the funeral. And the chant, as I read it, was, and Randa can correct me, it was, "We will not be humiliated," because the demand was made that Hamas stop supporting the people in Gaza. And the chant was, "We will not be humiliated." And that was what Nasrallah came to embody. The notion of, I wouldn't call it Arab pride, because I'm not too keen on the word pride, but I would say the demand to be respected and not treated as what the Nazis used to call the Untermenschen, the subhuman. And Israel demands the right to treat Arabs as Untermenschen, subhumans, and presumes for itself the title used by the Nazis of Übermenschen, the supermen, the Übermenschen, Über meaning above in German, Unter meaning below. And the refusal by Mr. Nasrallah to accept those terms of mutual regard. So it's still a very tense moment, whether or not the Israelis succeeded in this undertaking. I'll make one last comment in that regard. Everybody says, not everybody, but the received wisdom in the media being, why is Hezbollah firing rockets at northern Israel? Doesn't give Israel the right to defend itself. Well, you know, back in 2005, there was this whole talk in the international community. It even had its own hashtag. It was R2P, responsibility to protect. R2P, responsibility to protect. And it was all about how we have to accept the responsibility to protect people who are victims of genocide. Well, guess what? That's what Mr. Nasrallah and the Houthis did. They responded to R2P, the responsibility to protect a people who are the object of a genocide. Now, Israel demands not only the right to commit genocide, but it demands the right for nobody to interfere with its genocide. You have no right to interfere. We want to commit a genocide, and it's none of your business. Well, time will tell how that particular face-off will be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Norman. I'm going to read something quickly by Egypt's most prominent political prisoner, who has served his second 5-year stint and is due to be released tomorrow, but we all know he won't. His name is Abdel-Fattah, so he shares a very dear name in Egypt as well. And he comes from a dynastic political family whose activism has been intertwined with Gaza, purely because of the proximity of Egypt to Gaza, but he also talks about that. Muhammad al-Kurd, who was also in conversation with our dear, brilliant Randa last year, and I recommend that you read her essay on Zionist feelings, published in Monto Wise, but also Muhammad al-Kurd alluded to Abdel-Fattah's essay in his tome, in his magisterial tome, You Will Not Be Defeated. You have not yet been defeated. Published by Fitzcarraldo Editions in the UK. Abdel-Fattah has his last essay to end the book is called Palestine on My Mind, and it was written in September 2021. So I'm going to read an excerpt of it, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. Had I let the news of coverage of Gaza as an open-air prison blind me to the truth of what I'd seen with my own eyes and written in my own article, Gaza is besieged, but it has not been taken captive. And the difference is enormous. If I were free in Gaza instead of locked up in Cairo, I'd read books, play with children, enjoy the company of women, walk on the beach, work, make a living, I'd teach and I'd learn. I'd live and be alive at this moment. I would have breathed the dust cloud of the whole national territory as it moved instead of trying to analyze it from afar. I regret not escaping to Gaza. I know it's naive. I know I've not lived under bombardment, that visiting a siege is different to living under it. I know that this idea that's taken hold of me is only a sign that I'm getting old. Yes, I long for you, Palestinians, but I also long for a time when my will had not been torn from me, when my defeat was not complete. I sign off every letter with a drawing for Khalid. Khalid is his son. My drawing is no better than my singing, but autism pushes us to find a way to communicate without words. From memory, I draw a photo taken of us in Gaza. We're in Khan Yunis, and the barrier was in the background. A group of Egyptians all looking at the camera and Khalid on my shoulders. As the photo is taken, Khalid turns to look at the fence and points to the horizon stretching out behind it, the only one preoccupied by Palestine beyond the border. Do I have the right to dream of escaping to Gaza? Do I have the right to dream of a road to Cairo that passes through Gaza? Does a captive have the right to ask for help from the besieged? I know that these questions show how ancient I am, but I'm an Arab, and Palestine's always on my mind. And in my defense, I'll say that I refused to be humiliated in my country. And I never lowered my banners, and it should count that I stood in the face of my oppressors, an orphan, naked and barefoot, and my solace is that the tragedy I'm living is but my share of yours. I call out to you Palestinians, you are always on my mind. That was Abdel-Fattah's words from his prison cell, and hopefully he'll be released tomorrow, but knowing anything about Egypt, he'll rot in jail to be made an example of politicide. I'm gonna start with questions to Randa first. Sorry, Randa, let me just bring it up. Okay, so Randa, I think it was this year you wrote this piece in the New Arab, and I think you should read it fully. There's absolutely no doubt, you write, that the settler colony of Australia, whether governed by Liberal or Labor, is a loyal member of global Israel, committed to maintaining Western colonialism and hegemony. So I want to get you to expand on what you mean by global Israel and how dangerous it is.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So I've got notes because my brain is so dead. So how does Israel fit into a global order? I mean, we saw it, Netanyahu at the UN in the US placing a phone call to approve, to sanction or to authorize 2,000, 5,000 changes, American bombs to flatten 6 buildings in Lebanon. We see every 36 hours there's a US military shipment to Israel. And I think Biden and Harris just approved another $8 billion in military to continue this bloodbath. So we need to pause and try to make sense of this. And I guess most of us in this room already know this, but it's always still worth reflecting on this and insisting upon it. How do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of the complete dehumanization of Arabs? The fact that for a year we've seen babies shredded into pieces and buried in rice bags, or, you know, as Norman said, this is not a war, this is prosecuting a genocide. How do you have a military objective in bombing an IVF clinic? How do you make sense of the daily carnage and the fact that there is no Western government prepared to stop it? There were many at the beginning whose interpretive framework for this barbarity was the West is hypocritical, the West is applying a double standard. We know what the West is capable of because we've seen it with the Ukraine and Russia and sanctions and arms embargoes and so on. And the masks have been lifted now. The fact is, understanding the settler colonial racial logics is so critical. It's critical to understand so that we know how to organise, we know how to speak back. We know who our allies are. We know to refuse liberal postures and liberal promises. We know where our power lies. We know when it's time for reform and when it's time for revolution. And these may seem like trite points to make, but they are absolutely fundamental when you are an organiser, when you are actually working with people on the ground, especially a new generation who are coming to this movement post-October 7 and who have had, who have been seduced by the promises of liberal Western multicultural democracies and are suddenly shattered at the fact that we are seeing this carnage and Western governments aren't doing anything about it because they have failed or not been taught to historicize this moment and to understand it within the larger, broader context of Western imperialism and also the racial logics that sustain what is happening. It is absolutely imperative that we maintain clarity over our analytical framework and ownership of how we define and diagnose what is happening, and our ability to advocate for decolonization, our ability to advocate and to name Zionism as a racist political project. And this is something that is slowly, very fast actually, in almost a frenzy since 7 October, being robbed of us, that ability. And I call it discursive disarmament, and particularly from the university scene, where the idea is to disarm us, immobilize us from our analytical frameworks, from our interpretive analysis, from our lexicon of liberation, from our chants, from our slogans, from the clothes that we wear, from the way that we choose to diagnose and name what is happening. Norman said before this idea of the entitlement for Israel to commit genocide, and this is key. Because to name Zionism as a racist political endeavour, we have already seen moves in universities in the US that this is being cast, that Zionism is being constructed as a protected category of identity. And what that does, and we are seeing this slowly, we are seeing this happening now in Australia where there are moves to do this, moves to strip us of the right to criticise a political project, to strip us of the right to to understand what is happening in its political framework and conflate Zionism and Jewish identity. Of course, this has always happened. It's always been one of the touchstones of Hasbara, the idea that everything that we do is anti-Semitic. But we are seeing such a dangerous trend now. We are seeing attempts to change laws. We are seeing in the university space, we are seeing, teachers, lawyers, people in government jobs, across every sector of society, in the arts industry, this idea that Zionist feelings, Zionist identity must be protected. And it's as absurd as saying that you have the responsibility to make misogynists and homophobes and white supremacists safe, that they have the right to espouse their doctrines and be safe to do so. It is absurd as saying that you cannot criticize communism, otherwise you will offend Chinese people. It is creating the most absurd logics, all on the basis of protecting Zionism and protecting the Zionist political project that is Israel. And understanding that racial logic, the racial logics that animate this is key. Historicizing the white supremacy, the animated efforts to build this state on our land is key, and more work needs to be done, especially with newer generations, to understand that what we are fighting is white supremacy, the idea, and you can see it in the language of Israeli leaders, that we are fighting this is a civilizational battle. We are fighting the forces of darkness and the forces of light. They're not pretending, they're not shying away. If they're saying it, believe them when they tell you. When that doesn't work, when those logics don't work, when that propaganda doesn't work, because we're seeing on our screens this carnage, then the fallback position is to construct the enemy as terrorists and to plug into the war on terror Islamophobia logics that construct everyone as a terrorist, whether it's a Hamas militant fighter or a baby. No one is innocent in Gaza, as has been said. And then, that is important then to understand how Israel is profiting and serving a multi-billion military-industrial surveillance technology complex. There is a lot to be made, a lot of money to be made in this industry, which is why we in Australia have arms links with Israel, and why the financial logics that sustain this regime is what we need to be attacking. The fact that Israel is exporting battle-tested weapons and surveillance and technology, its AI surveillance in the West Bank, it exports it as battle-tested. That's its marketing strategy. One very quick example, just to contextualize in an Australian context, what we mean by global, that this is a global fight, is Ayman al-Qaeda, who is a Palestinian from Gaza, and he lives in Perth. And he wrote a very moving piece on something called the Deathscapes Project, which was looking at these global structures of imperialism and settler colonialism and racist violence and racial capitalism. And he said that when he arrived in Australia, there was something that he noticed. He noticed when he was doing research about the appalling deaths in custody of Aboriginal people in Australia, there was a case of Mr. Ward. Mr. Ward was killed in a police van that was being transported in Kalgoorlie. He basically burned to death in that van as they transported him across in extremely hot conditions. And the van that transported him was GS4 Security Company. He said that he recognized it was the same company as border police or border security were wearing on their uniforms, military uniforms, at Eretz crossing in Gaza. And he started to make those connections. And there are so many examples of those connections that we need to constantly be making. Why do we need to make this connection? Why do we need to understand and analyze this in a global context? Because it becomes part of the way that we organize and understand. It generates an understanding that of the indivisibility of justice, that we cannot be free here if they are not free there, that all of us are implicated, particularly if you're in the US. And here, our taxpayer money is going towards funding Israel's campaigns in Gaza. So understanding these global structures is empowering, because it means we're not fighting alone. We understand we all have a stake in this, and that what we need to do is have the imagination to envision a different world.
Well said. As you were talking, you were also talking, I was thinking about not just the colonial arithmetic, that goes on to enumerating where people fit and how to discipline them, but also the distraction, the constant distraction of being sidelined to worry about feelings. And some of the questions here talk about that, feelings or affects of manufactured.
Can I quickly make a point about
Yes,
feelings?
please.
So after Oslo, Hanan Ashrawi said that they made the people who are occupied responsibility for the security of their occupiers. What we can see now is that they are making the victims of a genocide responsible for the feelings of those who support a genocide. And this is the absurdity of what is being asked. The onus on us is on us to make others feel comfortable with the fact that they are supporting a genocide that is killing our people. And it is a shocking scenario when you're in a university space. And for example, last week I spoke at Sydney University. Our event was moved at the last minute to another location because it was going to cause potential distress to people in that building. Then we were given a directive that we must conduct and engage in our conversation in a professional and ethical legal manner, and preempting that we might be causing other people upset and hurt because we were talking against a genocide. This is the kind of situation now that I cannot even be Palestinian on campus without having to think of the fucking feelings of people who are supporting the killing of my people.
Yeah, it's the criminalization of it. And Norman, I'll turn to you. Your book called Method and Madness, which is very aptly named. You link how Gaza and Lebanon are intertwined as theaters of where this logic of genocide is being enacted. And you talked about the Dahya strategy or the Dahya doctrine. Can you explain further the origins of this strategy? And are we witnessing it now, where you say it's used as a disciplining the civilian population? Is this what we're seeing now? And can you explain what it is a bit more?
The Dahya doctrine is just a fancy term for terror bombing. During World War II, there was on both sides, as I understand it, I've not looked at the literature in ages now, but it was the British who initiated the terror bombings of cities in Germany in order to try to get the civilian population to turn against the Nazis. And in turn, the Nazis engaged in large-scale terror bombing in Britain and elsewhere in order to get the civilian populations to agree to defeat. And the targeting of the area which was targeted today, the Dahya area, it's a poor area of Beirut, and it's considered a stronghold of the Hezbollah, the party of God. And I was very dismayed today when I was watching Al Jazeera, where they said, well, yeah, it's true that a large number of people in the Dahya support Hezbollah. And they said it in a fashion as if to say, that's grounds for bombing it, which I thought was quite insane. It's a civilian population. There's no grounds for bombing civilians according to the laws of war or targeting civilians. As to what's going on at this particular moment, I wouldn't say the main element is the Dahya doctrine. The main, the targeting of civilian population in order to turn the population against Hezbollah. The main aim was pretty obvious. I said it at the very beginning when when October 7th happened. Maybe a week or two after October 7th happened, the question constantly came up. So what do you think will happen the day after? Meaning the day after it's finished. And I kept responding, and fortunately there's a record of it. I kept responding, I think at the risk of being the bearer of bad news, I believe that we're probably closer to the beginning of the conflict than the end. So it's pointless to talk about the day after. And my reasoning was, it may sound heartless, but the world is filled, at least at the elite level, with lots of heartless people, that for Israel, October 7th, after they shed a few salty tears, their leaders reacted to October 7th the same way as the American leaders reacted to September 11th. So Mr. Cheney, the vice president, Mr. Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Bush, the president, they all shed a few salty tears, and then they rubbed their hands in glee because this horror was also an opportunity. And they surveyed the map of the world, trying to decide which countries are we going to attack. In other words, exploiting the horror by turning it into an opportunity. And for Israel, October 7th was an opportunity, number one, to solve the Gaza question for once and for all, this pinprick at its side. Even in 2015, a senior Israeli official said that we can't keep carrying on these mowings of the lawn in Gaza, that there has to finally be an end to this. And he said the next war will be the last war. Now, it's true that there was 2021, but effectively what he said was accurate. Israel decided the day after October 7th, this will be the last war with Gaza. And basically their goal was to make Gaza unlivable, which they succeeded in. An honest reckoning would say Israel succeeded in its main goal, which was not to defeat Hamas, but to make Gaza unlivable. Most of you in the audience will be way too young to remember, but there was a famous revolutionary leader, Mao Zedong, and he led a guerrilla army in China. And he famously said that the guerrillas have to be like fish in the water with the population. Guerrillas have to be with the population like fish with the sea. And otherwise, unless you have a symbiotic relationship with the population, you can't win. And the reaction of the Americans in the West in general was, well, then you have to drain the sea, so the fish cannot survive. So Israel's main goal was to drain the sea in Gaza, meaning if you make Gaza unlivable, the people will have to leave. Right now, the estimates are there are 45 million tons of rubble in Gaza. It'll take 10 to 15 years to just clean out the rubble, because the rubble is mixed with unexploded ordnance, toxic substances like asbestos, and also a lot of dead bodies. So it'll take 15 years, 10 to 15 years to clean out the rubble. And then, even if they cleared out the rubble, there's no way Israel is going to allow cement into Gaza. It's going to claim if you let in cement, Hamas is going to use it to rebuild the tunnels. So either way, Gaza will not be rebuilt. And the estimates are about 50% of Gaza no longer exists. But that was only one of Israel's goals. This was a once for Israel, a once in a lifetime or several lifetimes opportunity. And they were going to exploit it to the hilt. And that meant going after their two main regional adversaries, which are Hezbollah and, of course, Iran. And Hezbollah being just a way station to Iran. And so now Israel is desperately trying to provoke a massive reaction from Hezbollah in order to go in and completely flatten at least the parts of Hezbollah, parts of Lebanon where Hezbollah has a strong base. If they succeed in that, and it's possible because of many disasters the past 2 weeks for Hezbollah, then they will try to make a clean slate of it all by going after Iran. So I think the issue is not so much the Dahya doctrine, the terror bombing of civilian populations to turn them against the leadership. The main issue now is Israel's determination to solve all of what it calls its existential challenges, exploiting to the maximum the events of October 7th.
Thank you for that analysis. Just as both you were talking, I'm going to ask, this is my final question to you both, if you could expand on it, and then we're going to use the questions from the floor. In the last year, we've had to put up not just with the squid gamification of Gaza, if you've seen that Netflix series, and the live streaming of the genocide and so on, but we've also had to put up and tears, a lot of tears, whereas our feelings are not taken into account, but crocodile tears are just, they're flowing heavily. But we've also had to put up with a lot of, I don't know if you've noticed this, but just as you were talking, a lot of celestial crap. Like it's always couched when Israel does anything, and this is what you were alluding to, Norman, about how you can't interfere me while I'm doing the killing. Like, I just wrote it here, like it's always religious diatribes and theological truisms, and it's always couched in this ecclesiastical elegy of, you know, like historical peoples that have vanished, of the Amorites and the Amalekites, and you don't have that same baggage when it came to South Africa. So I think you're working on a different front, because the charge of anti-Semitism is leveled straight away, as if it's a protected native species. And then the other thing, Islamophobia is so deeply embedded, even amongst Arab countries, that you can't break that shackle. Have you noticed that in that, just that whole, it just feels like it's a war of worlds, a very apocalyptic scenario, how they talk about Palestinians, and then also how they're killing Palestinians. It's done in a way as if it's, you know, like angelic, like it's an angelic form of genocide.
There's that element, absolutely, when you also consider, and this is one of the issues that we have, fighting this idea of Zionism as a protected category, because to criticize Zionism is constructed as criticism of Jewish identity, which is the fact that most of the Zionists that we are arguing with in our spaces are non-Jewish Zionists. The Christian Zionists in the US are the largest lobby group, Christians United for Israel. And so the seduction of seeing this in these civilizational, biblical imaginaries becomes even more ludicrous as a Palestinian, because you are fighting this idea that you are fighting against the idea, against the accusation that you are being anti-Semitic, when in fact you are fighting both Jewish Zionists and non-Jewish Zionists amongst anti-Zionist Jews. So it's just this this triangular paradigm where we are really being disarmed from naming the reality of what we are up against. It has a lot of those connotations, of those biblical connotations. And on the other hand, when you look at the way that the coverage of the pager attacks, the pager terrorist attacks, there was this glee, this, my God, this is like the references. I think Jan Fran, an excellent journalist of Lebanese background, read an article for Crikey yesterday documenting how many times Western journalists around the world used the reference to James Bond spy novels in describing what happened in Lebanon. So there was this kind of, even in Australia, we had this idea that it was brilliant, that it was, it was the stuff of spy novels. So it's always this idea that Israel really is this miraculous place that produces these kinds of amazing sort of ways to kill people.
Yes, seductive, and the whole fallacy of like it's a startup nation, but it's also a startup nation that kills people with drones. Norman, did you have anything to say about that? I know you're a militant atheist communist, and I think that's good for this group. I mean, you're hitting the right demographic. Can you mention, you mentioned that there's some story about your mother and her powerful testimonies telling you that I think you have to be militantly atheist in order to be a communist. So from that vantage point, okay, maybe I got it wrong, but from that vantage point, have you got anything to say about this sectarian discourse that's part and parcel of everyday language when it comes to Israel, that it has to be treated with a halo around it?
Those are many questions wrapped up into one.
Yes.
I would say that it's very hard to predict what the enduring effect of the events of the past year will be. I go back far enough to remember not just the 1982 war in Lebanon, but the succession of Israeli high-tech killing sprees against Gaza. And when Operation Cast Lead happened in December 2008 to January 2009, December 26th to January 17th, I wrote a little book. The title was based on an article by the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, and the book was titled "This Time We Went Too Far." Namely, Israel had crossed the threshold and its name had been blighted and blackened in international public opinion. For those of you whose memories go back that far, there were huge numbers of demonstrations. They were very large, opposing Israel's assault on Gaza during Cast Lead. And it looked like a threshold had been crossed, and Israel was now a pariah state. But actually, the memory of Cast Lead vanished quite quickly. And when Operation Protective Edge came along in 2014, July, August 2014 was 51 days. The demonstrations were very small against the Israeli action. When the Great March of Return happened in 2018, beginning March 30th, 2018, and Israel was just on a killing spree against these nonviolent demonstrators. There was no reaction internationally, absolute zero, including the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Nothing. So I think it's hard to predict whether this time Israel really did go too far and will now be branded with the scarlet letter of G for genocide. I'm not sure. I can't predict that. It does seem that, at least among the younger generations, Israel has now placed itself, in their minds at any rate, as a pariah state. But it's also true that the reaction by the other side has been so extraordinary. It's breathtaking. In the United States, I know I've studied the history of academic freedom in the United States. It is by far and away the biggest assault on academic freedom in American history. There's nothing that compares to it. Just to give you the most obvious example, the Israel's white Jewish supremacist billionaire supporters, its Jewish supremacist billionaire supporters, they managed to topple the president of Harvard University. That's no small achievement. They managed to topple the president of the University of Pennsylvania. That's also an Ivy League university. They effectively got rid of the president of Columbia University, President Shafiq. Now, bear in mind, I just named to you 3 women. Two of the 3 women are what are called people of color, persons of color. And we live in very woke times where you're supposed to be sensitive to what's called intersectional oppression of women of color. That didn't protect them at all. There was no dissent when they were toppled from office. And now, judging from what I'm reading in the papers, reading in the print media, and also in the web media, there's a genuine terror campaign being waged on college campuses. So you have to see both sides. Israel has boxed itself into a corner in the minds of public opinion, but its supporters are waging their own campaign of terror in order to defend their holy state.
Yeah, holiness definitely plays a part into it. And just when you were talking, Norman, you might know that our esteemed speaker, Randa, is also undergoing unrelenting attacks. So if you have any messages of support to her, email her, just so she could keep on doing what she's doing for us. And the toll... No, okay, don't email her then. No, but the toll that it's having on her family and her work, it's I don't want to say admirable, but just it's important to recognize.
Focusing on myself because honestly, like it's
That's okay.
Yeah, there's bigger issues, much bigger.
Yes. Okay. So we have half an hour. I need to plug the QR code again. If you can please donate. I know how much it already costs and things are tight at the moment as is, but we know how committed you are because this relates to the bunch of questions that I'm about to say. And all of them start with what? What? What can we do? What can we do to most effectively lobby our governments to stand up against what's going on? And then this one takes the cake. What does it take to stop Israel? Because all of us are feeling powerful after a year of protests and writing and talking and tweeting and posting and so on. It doesn't stop the killing machine. So I'm talking, maybe looking at your crystal balls, what can we do to stop the murder? As a global solidarity movement, from here, what can we do just to make this stop?
Well, anyone who's been involved in activism needs to let go of the idea, the neoliberal idea, that we as individuals have the right to see the fruit of our efforts. People jump on board and say, I've been protesting for a year and nothing's changing. You know, Norman, you've been in this a lot longer than I have. People who are committed understand that each of us in a struggle for justice simply has to keep doing the work, planting the seeds, understanding the trees may grow in the next generation, and stop insisting on the right to see a solution in our lifetimes, because you're not probably going to see it. And if that's going to stop you from doing the work, then the movement doesn't need you. What the movement needs is people who are committed to the long term, who understand also that it is okay to feel moments of despair, to oscillate between despair and hope and rage and love, and to understand that this is a collective movement and you need to take stock of the successes. For me, I can stand here as a Palestinian and say that this has been a narrative of genocide and loss and carnage over a year, and it certainly has. But there are other chapters in that narrative. This is also historically an unprecedented wave of global solidarity. We are seeing a world now where people are actually starting to stand up and question the promises, the false promises that have been made to them, particularly in Western countries. Question what is democracy? What is our foreign policy when it is made in the halls of, the White House, not Canberra? Question the duopoly, the fact that we are living a genocide under a Labor government. There are many, many things that are happening now that we should be proud of and that we should just keep building on. So whatever you're doing, keep doing it, but just give up on the idea that you need to see a solution now. I'm saying this as a Palestinian who is living, from the moment I wake up to the moment I sleep, watching this slaughter, taking in every single death as if it's from my own family. And yet, I understand what Norman said is right. We are actually at the beginning. So we are at the beginning of this dystopian reality. It is only going to get worse. I don't see that it is going to get better before it gets worse. The question is, how much are we going to suffer? What is the cost? How many Arabs have to die? These are questions also that you need to be asking people in your circles who are switched off, who do not understand that everybody stands to lose. Nobody is safe. The imperial boomerang, it's already happening. When you see the police brutality against protesters, when you see chemical weapons produced in Israel being used on students at Columbia University, when you see these reactionary moves from the state reverberating onto our populations, then what is to say when we have normalized genocide, that when climate change, when push comes to shove and resources are scarce, what's to say that governments aren't going to deem a designated section of society disposable? And we've been primed to understand and rationalize genocide. So what is to say that's not going to happen? Nora Erakat says it so beautifully. She says, Arabs are not low-hanging fruit, we are the canaries in the mine. And so we need to get people who have privilege and power, who have switched off, who think this doesn't respond to them, who think that Arabs are just born to die and suffer. We need to get them, if they have no humanity to understand that this is a question of humanity, if they don't, then at least self-interest, for them to understand they're not safe either.
Norman, can you respond about the long haul of this activist journey? What can be done about stopping the bloodshed and what you've seen from your decades of experience that you've been penalized for?
Basically, I agree with what Randa said. Um, I think, first of all, we can all agree on one point. The absolute cynic and the total idealist can both agree on one point. If we do nothing, nothing will change. That to me is a no-brainer. So if you think the situation is horrendous, then if you do nothing, it will remain horrendous. Number two, you really never know, you can never predict which of your actions at a particular point in time might actually bear fruit. Everybody knows the adage, it's also a folk song, it's always darkest before the dawn. So when things look the most grim, it may be the prelude to the dawn. I remember, for those some of you in the audience who remember, the darkest years of apartheid were the emergency years in the 1980s, when they imposed the emergency legislation, emergency rules. Who would have guessed that by the end of the 1980s, Nelson Mandela would be freed and South Africa would be liberated? We also lived through the era of the collapse, for better or for worse, of the Soviet Union, an unthinkable thought before it actually happened. And you can name many other unexpected events, totally unexpected events, which came to pass. So even the most acute of political observers can't predict with any certainty that your efforts will go to naught. Number three, even as the situation looks horrible, we have to always bear in mind it could actually look worse. I know that's small solace, but you recall the Israeli minister of antiquities who said we ought to nuke Gaza. And I have not the slightest doubt in my mind, that if they could have gotten away with it, they would. But there are all sorts of constraints that even a lunatic juggernaut like Israel is forced to act within. So I do believe the student demonstrations had a big impact. They did put limits on Israel via the Biden administration. They were not pleased at all with those demonstrations. But it's also true that when students left for the summer, when the whole Kamala Harris roadshow began, that it was a perfect media distraction. Gaza was lowered in its salience in the media, and it was not at all surprising at that point, with the student demonstrations out because of summer vacation, the Kamala Harris hysteria. It was at that point, you will recall, beginning in the summer, where day after day, Israel just committed one more atrocity. Bomb a school here, bomb a refugee camp here, kill 20 here, 60 there, 100 there, because they knew they were free. And on the other hand, it can be said that had not been for international pressure, the polio vaccine probably would not have been admitted to Gaza. So you can't know exactly the extent of your impact. But ultimately, I have to agree with Randa when she says you can't decide whether or not to participate on the basis of whether or not you're going to win. That's just not, in my opinion, the right basis. The right basis should be that you do it because it's the right thing to do.
Well said. I have another question following on from that. We'll go to Norman first, then Randa. Famed Israeli academic Ilan Pappé said a few months ago that this is the beginning of the end of the Zionist project or of Israel. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not a soothsayer.
Yeah.
I don't think, those sorts of pronouncements
Yeah.
need to come from a crystal ball, not from an analysis of the situation. I can't predict with any kind of certainty where things are headed and whether or not this is the beginning of the end. It's just impossible to make those, in my opinion, it's impossible to make with even approximate accuracy predictions of that sort.
Randa, do you have anything on that?
I think what we can see happening is that to criticize and ridicule Zionism is no longer taboo among the next generation, who are not captured and seduced by the kind of propaganda that older generations have been marinating in. And so if you just jump on TikTok, on social media, you see the mainstreaming of Israel as a pariah state. The fact that I keep seeing it in comedy skits, which I think is a great barometer of the sort of the public pulse in which now we can see the mainstreaming of criticizing Zionism, and that is part of how we are going to dismantle the system and its structures. So I think that is something that we can see now, that it's not invincible and it's not taboo, and I think that is critical.
Another question. What impact will the unprecedented International Court of Justice ruling on the illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories have on ending this illegal occupation? If I can go to you first, Randa.
It's a situation where we can't afford to be cynics, even though we know international law has traditionally been, the site of unfulfilled promises for Palestinians. We still can't underestimate how monumental it was to see South Africa take on Israel and charge it with genocide, or to see the International Court of Justice deliver its ruling on the occupation, and to also take that extra further step in seeing it as the right of the self-determination, which is not contingent upon negotiations. The fact that it took on board the Palestinian case, Gaza, the occupied territories, Palestinians in Israel. I can't remember if they took on the question of refugees, but these are hugely important. At the very least, they give us discursive power. There is power in being able to say to our employers, plausible genocide. There is power in being able to say to our opponents and adversaries, you have a ruling that declares your occupation illegal. There is power in being able to tell states you are obliged to take steps to not participate and be complicit in the occupation machinery. So it is providing us with tools that we need to dismantle the system. And we can still be cynical about how international law functions as part of wider white supremacist structures and as a tool for Western governments. But these are massive steps. At the very least, people are asking, why is it that international law is hostage, excuse the pun, to the UN Security Council vetoes that the US constantly applies?
So these are questions that people have been talking about for decades, but now are becoming mainstreamed. I don't take that lightly. I think that these are hugely historic and hugely important and monumental in building our movement and providing us with an arsenal of an arsenal from which that we can now prosecute the case for dismantling of occupation and apartheid and resisting genocide.
Well said.
I totally agree. Before the Palestine issue was at the center of the International Court of Justice, from 1950 until 1970, for 20 years, there were all these back and forths at the International Court of Justice concerning South Africa's control over Southwest Africa, what became Namibia. And one of the main people who was involved in that litigation, or wrote one of the main works on that litigation, is a fellow from South Africa named John Dugard. John Dugard was the family lawyer for the Nelson Mandela family and also for the Bishop Tutu. And Dugard was the senior counsel at the ICJ during the recent meetings. And he once commented, eventually the ICJ in 1971, the ICJ declared South Africa's control over Southwest Africa, Namibia. The ICJ declared it illegal, like they just did with Israel's control over the occupied Palestinian territories. And Dugard was the leading scholar on the subject. And he commented that, of course, the ICJ ruling didn't overturn apartheid, but it made its contribution. So one shouldn't have too high expectations. But I think what Randa said is absolutely correct. It's a powerful weapon in the battle for public opinion to be able to say that 15 of the 17 judges on the ICJ concluded that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide in Gaza. That's a very hard thing to dismiss. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is the highest judicial body in the world. And then the ICJ proceeded to declare that Israel's occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem is illegal under international law. And to be able to go on a television program, to be able to go on a podcast in a debate, and to be able to say, well, you say they're all anti-Semitic. So are you telling me that all 15 judges or 14 judges on the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, including the American judge, Sarah Cleveland, including the German judge, Israel's most faithful ally in Europe, Mr. Nolte, are you telling me that all 14 judges are anti-Semites? Is that really plausible? Or, in the case of the genocide in Gaza, if you take every humanitarian organization in the world, bar none, Save the Children, UNICEF, UNESCO, Oxfam, CARE, C-A-R-E. You take every humanitarian organization in the world, they're all saying that Israel is systematically targeting civilians in Gaza. Are you telling me all of the human rights organizations in the World Health Organization, Doctors Without Borders, Norwegian Refugee Council, are you telling me they're all anti-Semitic? That doesn't sound very plausible. So exactly what Randa said, it's a powerful weapon in the battle to try to win over public opinion. However, as she also said, there's every reason to be cynical about international law, and there's every reason to be cynical about the implementation of that law in the face of the US and British veto.
One more question, or how you feeling, guys? One more? Okay,
Yeah,
I like this question.
I have to go to sleep so that, because it's 12:30 here. So we could just make it one more question.
One more question. Okay, I like this one. I think you'll like this one. You could have a stab at it first. How does one convince someone who is blinded by Zionist propaganda that the genocide is real? You want to start first, Norman?
There's a hardcore of people who you can't convince. And I consider it a squandering of energy and time to try to convince them. However, that's something very different than engaging in a public debate with them. Because if you're engaged in a public debate with a hardcore opponent, you're not trying to convince that person. You're trying to persuade those who are listening. So on the one hand, on a one-to-one level, there are certain people who I believe there's no point in squandering energy trying to convince. They're basically what you could call bad faith actors. They're not open to being convinced. They've made up their minds and they're just pretending to be good faith actors, that is listening, weighing the evidence and so forth. So on one level, there's a core of people you can just write off and move on. But that same individual, you should surely, definitely, absolutely take advantage of every opportunity to publicly debate, because you're not trying to convince them in the public debate. You're trying to convince those who are listening. And those who are listening, a large percentage, you cannot know exactly, but quite a large number are good faith listeners, weighing the arguments, weighing the evidence, and are ready to be convinced if you put forth a compelling case.
The only thing I would add to that is it depends on your proximity to that person. I agree with everything Norman said. There are some people who have these kinds of people in their families, in their small social networks. If cutting people off is not an option, if you're working with someone like that, I still believe it's not worth the energy in trying to prove something to somebody who is clearly denying what is in front of their face. We are at a point now where nobody can plausibly deny what is happening. It is on our screens. And so like Norman said, it is a bad faith actor and it is not worth expending your energy on them. But if they are in your small circles and you have to work with these people or you have to be with them in your family, then you need to find ways to protect yourself from them, find ways to, remove yourself from that proximity when you can. But I would never, ever put myself in a situation where the denominator of our argument is I am a human being that deserves the right to live. That person is not worthy of my time or energy.
Here. Can you please keep it going for two master debaters and rhetoricians and theorists and analysts, Norman Finkelstein and Randa Abdel-Fattah. Thank you so much for your time and your precious work.